Hello, Garland Nixon here. It's Friday morning. That means we're hanging out with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov, who knows all things covert action. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here. We're hanging out with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. He's got a great website. It's covertactionmagazine.com. That's Covert Action Magazine. All things, shall we say, evil, all things related to covert action, to CIA and MI6 and all their evil and devious deeds. And today we've got a great article. It's called Gaza Ceasefire Agreement Furthers Ongoing Age of Imperialism. We're going to talk about both the Gaza ceasefire and what's going on in Venezuela. There's a new book that shows that, as the old saying goes, the more things change, the more things stay the same. Meet the old boss, same as the new boss, things of that nature. And what happens is, Americans kind of fall into this system of beliefs where they think their government's the good guys. And it's always like this. Yeah, we used to do all kind of terrible things, but that was back then. Now our governments come around and they're doing justice and righteousness and they're standing for democracy. We're standing for democracy. Jeremy, let's start with the ceasefire, which the fire hasn't ceased, but let's just say this, they called it a ceasefire, and how, in your opinion, the details, the devil's in the details, demonstrates colonialism, imperialism, and the lack of democracy.
Well, it's pretty blatant in this case because it aims to set up a governing commission over Gaza headed by the U.S. president and headed by Tony Blair, two white men. What right do they have to rule over Gaza and Palestinian territory? It's a return to pretty open forms of colonialism, and that's what a number of commentators pointed out right after the agreement. And of course, setting aside Blair's record, in the Middle East, his championing the Iraq War and the catastrophe that entailed. So you can imagine what the Palestinians think of having somebody like him rule over them is awful.
Well, it also reminds me of you remember this name, L. Paul Bremer. The United States overthrew the government of, and here's what we know about colonialism. It's a scam. It's an economic scam. And when they overthrew the government of Iraq, L. Paul Bremer, there's a book, I forgot what it was called. It was called Something in the Emerald City. I forgot what it was. I read it.
Oh, yeah, Imperial Life in the Emerald City. Yeah.
Right. And it was about what was going on inside the green zone. And there was one chapter that's called Bring Some Duffel Bags. That was close to the name. And basically some guy went there, somehow got into Iraq, made his way to the green zone, and he didn't even have a company, and he made up some company or whatever that was supposed to provide security, and he got a multi-million-dollar contract, and he contacted his buddy back home and said, get here and bring some duffel bags, because the money was all in cash. And so basically, when you get a Tony Blair who's done nothing but fill his pocket, it's obvious to me that this is going to be about money laundering and stealing money, like it always is.
Absolutely. And, there are newly discovered oil deposits off the Gaza coast that I think is really what is coveted. And the estimated value, I have it in my article. And I have another article coming out, I think, next week, because I interviewed this woman named Charlotte Dennett, who, she is the actually daughter of one of the CIA's top Middle East experts. And actually her father was killed in a suspicious plane crash, but she's become an expert on oil pipelines and everything related to oil, and she's done a lot of good research on this that I was drawing off of in her book that she published a few years ago, and she discusses the Gaza Marine offshore field and the estimated value, yeah, I guess it's listed there, billions of 500
Yeah,
billion.
half $1 trillion.
And they don't want the Palestinian getting that, because that will strengthen them immeasurably, and then they can set up a state that's with a strong economy, and that's exactly what Israel and the United States don't want. And as you say, yeah, it's just naked greed. They just want to. It's really a few profiteers who want to take control of that oil and become billionaires and rule the world, and so.
Wow. And I'm looking at that, and there's the Gaza Strip, and right off the coast of the Gaza Strip, what do you know? An oil field. And I'm supposed to think that it is a coincidence that they bombed Gaza flat, they kill all the people, they put a criminal like Tony Blair there, and by coincidence, there's another coincidence, and just coincidentally, we've got to save Venezuela, from an evil dictator and stop all the drug dealing. And what do you know? What do you have in Venezuela? The largest gold reserve on earth. Now, I have a feeling if Venezuela's number one export was, I don't know, tomatoes, we probably wouldn't be. They wouldn't need democracy so bad.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's been a long history of U.S. interference in Venezuela going back to the 19th century. And the Rockefeller interest had huge holdings in Venezuela and ownership of the oil for many, many years. And then, in late 90s, you had the Chavez revolution, where the Venezuelans finally took control over their own oil resources and nationalized it. And Venezuela has been under attack by the United States ever since. I mean, there was a coup in 2002 that Chavez was able to beat back. And I think this Nobel Prize winner, Maria Corina Machado, was supporting that coup. And there have been repeated regime change efforts. I mean, Obama called Venezuela the greatest national security threat or something like that when he was president. And there was an uprising after there were elections after Chavez died that Maduro won, and actually the Jimmy Carter Center said that was one of the best elections he'd ever seen, and yet the U.S. then Obama called Venezuela a great national security threat, and they ratcheted up sanctions on the pretext that that the elections were fraudulent, even though the Jimmy Carter Center had said it was the best election he'd seen, and let alone the problem we have with elections in the United States. And there was a major uprising then in 2013, a very violent uprising. And I think Machado was one of the ringleaders. And government buildings were burned, and Chavez supported were lynched, and Maduro supported. I mean, there was a lot of violence. And then, NED claimed these guys are the instigators of the riot are political prisoners because they face charges. But this was like 10 times worse than January 6th. I mean, there were actual mob riots and violent burned buildings, murdered leftists. So these were real serious crimes. They're not prisoners of conscience, as NED claims. And in fact, they left the country, and now they have been railing against the government and aligning with the U.S. effort to overthrow it. And now, Trump seems to be taking it to the next level. So, and I mean, look, there's a serious problem in the U.S. economy. So this may account for the aggressive drives. And a lot of, we're seeing, and a lot of, Trump's, I've been reading, I'm not an economic expert, but I'm reading as much as I can. It seems that the tariffs are backfiring considerably, like the trade war Trump has imposed on China is causing all kinds of problems to the U.S. economy. It's affecting farmers and their ability to sell some of their crops. It's affecting supply chains. China's fighting back with its own measures against the United States. And, there's so much trade between the U.S. and China and within the global economy. So the U.S., economy has been stagnant for a long time, but Trump's policies are backfiring, making things worse. So we're seeing them engage in these aggressive maneuvers and internationally. And at the same time, I think that this billionaire class has really secured its control over the U.S. government, the most greedy elements. And they're the ones who just want to seize oil or other resources from other countries. And I mean, the case of Venezuela, there's no real pretext. Like, they're just destroying these ships, which for all we know are just regular fishing boats. But even if they had narcotics, that's illegal. I mean, firstly, it's not a capital offense. Trafficking drugs, but everybody has a right to due process. It's illegal to just start blowing up ships and murdering people because you claim they're trafficking drugs. I mean, first you have to produce evidence. That there's no due process or legality here. But I mean, unfortunately, we've seen for many years the U.S. foreign policy has no regard for international law and has often flouted international agreements or refused to sign them or sanction the international court because some Americans started to be on the radar of that court. So,
Well, one of the issues they have now, in fact, is, did you know this? There were some survivors from the last attack, and apparently two of them, there were some people who were killed that were from Trinidad. And they said, well, apparently the families and the people that know them said they were just coming home on a boat. They were not in any way involved in drug trafficking. They were coming home. And, like, for instance, if you've ever been to Aruba, what is it, 40, 50 miles off the coast? So you've got islands, the area, people get in the boat and they run in their boats and they run back and forth to the islands in the Caribbean regularly. It's nothing. When I was in Aruba, there's a lot of Venezuelans there. Like I said, there's a lot of workers there that they just an island a few miles off the coast. So you have people from these Caribbean islands who get on boats and run back and forth between the islands for one reason or another. And the United States has no right to arbitrarily say that, well, those are whatever. And we all know that this is simply an operation. The other thing about the Gaza ceasefire, it appears to me, is, and I hate to sound like use a hackneyed cliche, but there's no there. They said there's going to be a ceasefire. Well, they haven't stopped shooting and killing people. They haven't stopped bombing. The Israelis are making excuses. And it doesn't appear to me that there is the details have been, it was just like, okay, they're going to stop the so-called, they're going to stop the genocide. And there was a celebration, and there's all of the pomp and circumstance. We're going to sign, we're going to do this and all of that. But I can't find anywhere like the actual details of what's going to happen and when and who's going to handle it. You know what I mean? It seems very amateurish, maybe intentionally.
Yeah, well, I think from what I read, the Israelis are supposed to, move back, but they're still going to be there controlling all movement into the Gaza Strip, and then the United States is supposed to send more troops into the area. So it's very convenient for U.S. imperial interest to consolidate their control, because it's giving an excuse to send more U.S. troops. And the U.S. already has troops in Israel. They've set up secret military bases there, and some of that information has come to light, that there are American troops stationed at those bases in the Negev desert. So, I mean, and that's underlying it. Really, the United States has used Israel for many years to consolidate more of its power in the Middle East and to access the oil, which is what it's all about, really.
And let's look at something else to go along with your article. And this was written back in 2023. Behind Israel's endgame for Gaza, theft of offshore gas reserves. In 1999, British gas discovered the existence of natural gas in the Gaza marine field, 20 nautical miles off the coast of Gaza. Determined the field could contain up to 1 trillion cubic feet of gas. Again, there's Gaza again. And again, so in this area, we've got gigantic oil fields that have been discovered. We've got gigantic gas fields that have been discovered. And you look where Gaza is, and it's easy to see that, particularly in light of the U.S. economic, issues that we're dealing with. It's easy to see realistically that they're murdering people, but it certainly, the appearance is, this is Iraq. This is um, Libya. This is Venezuela. This is another area where the local and indigenous people have to be wiped out so that the imperialists can come in. And it's always the U.S. and like BP or something can come in and steal their resources.
Hmm. Yeah, unfortunately, there's a long pattern of history where different empires have always emerged, and they're out to steal or control the resources of other regions, and they'll massacre and brutalize the population. And for the last 500 years, Western empires have been the dominant empires and have used this ferocious violence. And unfortunately, there have been many genocides and massacres over those years, and this is just a continuity. And yeah, in my article, I review this book by a professor at the University of Montreal. His name is Samir Saul, and yeah, he's a historian. And the book is titled "Imperialism as Rampant as It Ever Was." And he points out that there was a brief period, in the 90s, I guess, at the end of the Cold War, when analysis of empires kind of went out of vogue, and there was some books like Hart and Negri wrote an influential book that empire was kind of passé. But clearly what we've seen in the last 20, 25 years makes clear that that's not the case, and that we're living in an age of hyper-imperialism. And we've seen that, especially in the Middle East. But yeah, Venezuela, I mean, they're ramping up kind of traditional overt method, where a lot of U.S. intervention in South America was more covert, in part because there is an aversion to empire. The United States was founded as a republic, in revolt against the British Empire. So there's a stigma with the concept of empire, and Americans don't like to think of themselves as empire or imperialist. And that's one reason a lot of U.S. foreign policy interventions have been covert. And that the U.S. is more of an informal empire, but we are seeing more blatant forms of imperialism, back to the kind of 19th century variant, with this gunboat diplomacy in Venezuela, and with this peace agreement in Gaza, where there's white men being appointed to rule directly over Gaza.
What's interesting is, let's talk about this in your article. Once again, the article is at covertactionmagazine.com. Gaza Ceasefire Agreement Furthers Ongoing Age of Imperialism. And what's interesting, when we look at this book, Imperialism as Rampant Today as in the Past, the Samir Saul defines imperialism as involving a relationship of domination or force linkage that enables, and this is the important part, I think, the strongest to appropriate wealth, land, raw materials, manufactured goods, capital, or labor generated by a workforce, extorted from the weakness. That's what we're seeing. There is this pretense, there is this propaganda. Oh, we're going to stop. Usually it's a combination of something like we're stopping drugs, with we're saving the people from a dictator. There's some various combinations, but when it comes down to it, it's always we're going to dominate them, and we're going to appropriate their resources through extortion, violence, and criminality. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And yeah, it's always framed in this, liberal rhetoric and human rights rhetoric, and that's similar. European empires use this these self justifications to make it seem like a benevolent or righteous endeavor to their own population, and they claim they are liberate. The European empires claim they are liberating Africa from the Arab slave trade. So, and they use this civilizing mission type rhetoric, and it's not too different today. I mean, the U.S. rhetoric is, yeah, we have to save these countries from evil dictators or genocidal maniacs. Although in most cases, when they've made claims about genocide, they're not well founded at all. Like with Milosevic, in the '90s, they claimed he was this genocidal maniac, and they had to bomb the Balkan region to save it from him. But they couldn't convict him in the
Right.
international court. There was no evidence, and he had actually been trying to save the Yugoslav Federation. And there were, the worst atrocities in that war were committed by the Croat forces, and there were atrocities on all sides. And often these are complex conflicts, but they simplify it, make it seem like there's just some evil dictator that we have to go in and save the natives from. But they don't disclose that there's oil, as you say. If there were tomatoes and lettuce, they wouldn't go into that country. They have no interest in their politics. But when there's a lot of oil there, well, but they don't advertise that. So
one of the things that you talk about a lot, that you focus on, is covert actions. Interesting that Donald Trump has now come out and said, ironically, I thought covert actions were undercover, but he came out ironically and said, the CIA is doing covert action. And I thought, well, it ain't covert anymore, but who, like we didn't know it now. I have heard, basically, actually, when I was in Venezuela, I was told that the Mossad has been in there trying to overthrow Venezuela for the last decade and a half, right? They're very well aware. The Mossad, isn't that interesting that the people there say the Mossad is here trying to overthrow Venezuela? That we look at this woman who got the Nobel Prize, Maria Cachado, whatever her name is, that everything about her is, yes, we must align with Israel. We must do this for Israel, that she's obviously on board with the most heinous of international crimes. And now we're hearing that the CIA is they're supposed to do, they've been given the go ahead to use violence or whatever the case may be, as if the CIA needs they use violence in here. Your thoughts on CIA operations in Venezuela, and maybe some of the history of some of the evil deeds that you know of that the CIA has been doing in Venezuela and or other places in South America.
Okay, sure. Yeah, well, there's a lot to tackle there. Well, first, with your point about the Mossad, yeah, there's a good book I have. I think the author was on my shelf somewhere here. I think the author's name was Jane Hunter. She looked at how the Mossad, how like the U.S. used the Israelis to do a lot of the dirty work. And the Mossad was very active, like in the Central American wars in the 80s. They were involved because I think the Reagan or whatever U.S. administration is trying to shield the American public, like what I was saying, because the Americans don't want to think of themselves as imperialists or meddling so extensively in countries. They get other, that's why Israel has been so valuable to the United States. They help build up their intelligence service and then get them to do a lot of the dirty work. So it allows for more plausible deniability and even less of American footprint. So there's a long pattern of Mossad involvement in covert operation. And this book goes into their role in Africa. Like the Israelis actually helped bring Idi Amin to power in Uganda in the 70s because there had been a socialist leader, Milton Obote, and the U.S. and U.K. didn't want him because they don't like socialists who want to take control over their country's natural resources. So they used the Israelis in that operation to do a lot of the heavy lifting, and other African countries, in Congo and in Central America, South America. So this is nothing new. What you're saying, the Mossad has often been used for that purpose, and that's why Israel is so valuable to the U.S. empire and has supported Israel for all those years. And now, related to your other questions, the New York Times had an interesting article this morning about like saying, Donald Trump has ordered the CIA into Venezuela. Let's look at, the CIA, and they admitted actually, like what you're saying earlier, that the CIA has a terrible record in the past. They basically said that in this article, and they're like, let's look at they give an overview of some past, operations that are known the CIA was involved in, like the coup in Guatemala, Cuba, and Chile. And they're pretty frank that these were morally abhorrent operations, that they overthrew a democracy in Guatemala, and they used all kinds of skullduggery and trickery and deceit. And the Cuba, it was not a bad article because it was a pretty accurate history, for a short article, and it was pretty critical. But yeah, I take your point. Like, it's kind of like, oh, we did bad things in the past, but then you read some of the other articles in the Times today on Venezuela, and they're repeating the story. Oh, he's a dictator, and they're not really going into the oil interests or that history of U.S. oil interests. involvement or desire to control Venezuela's oil. So it fits the paradigm you were describing at the beginning of the show. At least they are acknowledging a critical aspect of history. And I mean, there's a good book by Anya Parampil, who writes for the Gray Zone. And she wrote a book on Venezuela. I think it was published last year, and I did a review on it. And it was a good overview. It was called Corporate Coup. And I mean, first she made the point that the U.S. government had been taken over by corporations a long time ago, and that's what they're trying to do in Venezuela. It's basically a history of U.S. covert operation and regime change since the Chavez government came in 1998. And it goes up to the first Trump administration and up to, I think, the early Biden period. And yeah, she has discussion of this mercenary operation. There was a mercenary soldier named Goudreau who tried to launch a coup out of Colombia. He was recruiting other paramilitary elements out of Colombia and trying to enter the country. And I think he had some association with Juan Guaido, who in the first term, the Trump administration tried to anoint him as Venezuela's leader, even though he had no support within Venezuela and no standing. He didn't hold any elected positions within Venezuela. And so that's, blatant imperialism. They're trying to anoint him as the leader, and he had limited support, very limited support at all. And he was tied to extremists like his mentor, Leopoldo Lopez, was a key coordinator of the Guarimba revolt uprising in 2014, after that election that the Carter Center had sanctioned, and then he orchestrated these violent pogroms, basically, and he was thrown out of he had to flee the country, and NED presents him as this great human rights hero. And meanwhile, he organized these violent pogroms, and he was charged with terrorist crimes. So anyway, they were trying to get in Guaido, but that he had no standing in Venezuela, so it was a complete failure. But they have been involved in these covert operations for a long time, and this is one that got exposed with this mercenary named Jordan Goudreau. So, yeah, I mean, this has been going. Really, it's nothing new that Trump may be providing a lot more money to the CIA than in the past. So these are more expanded operations they may be engaged in now, and that he's openly announcing it, is a bit of a departure. So.
Well, yeah, and the guy Lopez, if I recall correctly, to show how the U.S. and its allies, vassals, whatever you want to call them, in Europe are involved. The guy Lopez was involved in trying to start a coup and have all kind of violence in Venezuela. And then when the Venezuelan government came in after him, he ran to the Spanish embassy and hid in the Spanish embassy to get Spain. And Spain was, working with him, trying to help him and try to defend him. So clearly, if he went to the Spanish embassy, clearly some of that operation was working out of the Spanish embassy. And I wanted to ask you about this. And it appears to me that there's a long history of the U.S. using its embassies, in South America. And let's not forget the one in Libya, the infamous one with Libya and the guy, Chris, what's his name, that got killed. If you could comment on the history of the U.S. using its embassies basically as the CIA outposts.
Oh yes, yeah. I mean that came out in these newly declassified Kennedy documents. There was, even more evidence of the extent to which U.S. embassies were being used as a cover for CIA operators, and that was long known. And that's something back in the Philip Agee day when he was outing CIA agents. Many were listed in the U.S. embassy of particular countries. Agee himself may have been listed. I'm not sure, but that's a strong possibility. So that's very common practice, is that a lot of the embassies is actually dominated by CIA operatives, and they're involved in covert operations for generations in a lot of these countries. And Venezuela, as we've said, is a key target because It's an oil-rich country, and also it's become a symbol. I think the Chavez Revolution was so important because it's a symbol of the so-called third world, standing up for itself and against empires, and it was trying to forge alliances, regional cooperation, and inspire other South American countries to adopt similar political economic model and to form these alliances, economic alliances, military alliances that would enable them to unify against the predator, the United States, and strengthen themselves and become more independent over time and have strong economies that are interdependent with each other, not dependent on the United States, and weak and susceptible to American economic penetration and military penetration. And that was a strategy, the Pan-African movement and the Pan-Arab movement, and the history that the U.S. and CIA have always gone after those kind of governments. And they're willing to ally with the most extremists, even in the Middle East. Muslim fundamentalists were often used against Pan-Arab socialists, and Nasser. Chavez, you can compare him to Nasser of an earlier generation, who's getting the Middle East to stand up for itself, become more autonomous and independent, take control over its natural resources, and become a regional power broker. And that's what the U.S. and other Western power really fear. So they go after these guys, Nasser, Chavez, Gaddafi. It's always the same kind of leader. And Maduro's not as charismatic as Chavez, but he's continued a lot of the same policies. So.
Well, I've been, I've been to Venezuela. I was an election observer there. I've met with various people, and I can tell you that only wish our election was that clean. Well, you know what the great contradiction? Donald Trump says, now, I argue that in 2016, there was a massive coup attempt, and that was Russiagate. I argue that in 2020, what the FBI did regarding the Hunter Biden laptop was election interference. Okay. Whether or not, what difference it made, I don't know. But Donald Trump argues that he was robbed in 2020 and he tried to fight it. That's his position. I'm not taking a position on any of that stuff. I'm just saying this is the argument, right? 2016, they tried to coup me. This is Donald Trump. 2020, they stole it from me. This is Donald Trump. The Democrats, 2016, Putin stole it, whatever, right? Okay. 2024, Elon Musk used X to steal it for Trump. So both parties constantly say our election, every one of them is stolen. None of them are legitimate. And then what do they say about Maduro? He suppresses legal elections. He suppresses the vote of the people. Well, wait a minute. Both parties argue that our elections are illegitimate. Should somebody come invade our country? Our elections are illegitimate, absolutely illegitimate. What's your problem, Maduro? The elections are illegitimate, though the people of Venezuela feel that they're legitimate. An outside government who covets the oil of Venezuela says they're illegitimate.
Yeah. And well, you can go back. I'm a historian. I mean, there's the 2004 election. I read a book by Craig Unger, who's a very good investigative journalist, and he particularly investigated the Bush family. But he uncovered a lot of evidence of vote rigging in the decisive state of Ohio, and he believes that he made a I was convinced by his book and evidence that election was stolen from John Kerry. That you can go back to the 44. There was a blatant coup in the Democratic Party against Henry Wallace, who wanted a peaceful approach toward Russia and more progressive domestic economic program. And he threatened the business elite, and they used all kinds of trickery and illegal methods to get rid of him. They're the coup of 1963 against John F. Kennedy. That should be understood as a coup d'etat. So you can go on and on.
RFK Jr., that was a preemptive coup. I mean, RFK Sr., That was a
Yeah,
preemptive
and I
coup.
would
They killed
argue
him.
JFK Jr. too. He was an up and coming, and he was going to, he had the charisma, and he would have been, like we discussed this on the show, winning candidate. So they had to preempt that very early. And then they've taken out other leaders, like Paul Wellstone was going to be a decisive vote against the Iraq War in the Senate, and his plane was brought down. And then you can look at the role of money in politics. I mean, we have no freedom because it's a dictatorship of money in our country. If you don't have billions of dollars and the ability to raise billions of dollars, you can't be a viable candidate. And even in local races, unless you're of the millionaire class or you have the connections in that class, or you have to cater your policies to corporate interest, then you might be able to get the money needed to run a competitive race. So that excludes genuinely progressive people from running. So we have a nice way of saying it would be imperfect system here. So how can we judge other countries? I mean, politics is difficult in any country when you're dealing with money, power, wealth. There's going to be corruption or skullduggery, but it occurs in almost every country. But we can't really take the moral high ground in our country, given what's gone on here, and we've given some examples.
Here's another thing, and this is only logical to me. Now, even our government admits that the Venezuelan government has given millions of their citizens guns, millions, and said we must defend our revolution. That's what and they'll tell you we will defend our democracy, right? So here's my understanding. Maduro is a dictator who dominates over his people and hates his people. They hate him and he hates them and he just mistreats them. He abuses them, right? And then he gives millions of them guns. Well, if he gave them guns, wouldn't they overthrow him? Wouldn't they say, hooray, we can finally stop the dictator? What the hell kind of dictator arms all the people and then says, fight with me, fight for yourself. And then the people say, okay, dictator, we hate you. That's a great idea. Let's all fight together to expel the imperialists. I find that there is a logical train of thought here that ends with the dictator gave the people money. I mean, gave the people guns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's also, just in reading the New York Times, I recall reading an article a few years ago where they acknowledged that poverty rates have been cut by something like 60% under Chavez's government, and that was continuing under Maduro until the sanctions were imposed. So, I mean, yeah, what kind a dictatorship that lifted 60% of its people out of poverty. And that's why they've won a lot of. They keep winning elections.
Yeah, that's the bottom line. And the people there, if you talk to them, they're struggling. They know why. They understand it's the sanctions, and they would rather struggle than go back under U.S. domination. They'd rather struggle under the sanctions. They'd rather fight and die for their country than return to U.S. domination. Countries that have been under U.S. domination understand how bad it is, particularly in South America. When you look at what happened under Pinochet, and some of the other dictators, maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Some of the dictators that the U.S. have put in power in South America and some of their diabolical and murderous deeds.
Sure, yeah, and certainly that was one of the worst cases where you had a democratically elected leader, Salvador Allende, who was a socialist who wanted to nationalize Chilean copper industry that was owned by two major U.S. corporations, Anaconda and Kennecott, because Chile is number one copper producer in the world. And yeah, Allende was kind of a follower of Castro, but wanted to achieve socialism, more democratic socialism, and he came under attack immediately upon his election. And the Nixon administration, sabotaged the Chilean economy and helped coordinate the coup. Well, first they had to get the armed forces to become loyal to the far right in Chile. So Kissinger was involved with the murder of the General Rene Schneider, was the head of the army who was loyal to Allende. They murdered him. They cultivated alliance with the far right in the military, led by Augusto Pinochet. He carried out a coup, and then his henchmen started rounding up Allende supporter or leftists rounded them, or suspected leftists, rounded them up in to the soccer stadium in Santiago, and armed death squads started shooting and assassinating them. And there were even some Americans who got killed. Two Americans, young people, Charles Horman and Frank Tarugi. I recently did a review of a book of their case, and how the U.S. Embassy covered that up because it exposed their U.S. Embassy and CIA deep complicity with the death squad operations and mass murder that went on there. So, and there was, Pinochet ran the Operation Condor, which was set up by the CIA it was kind of Phoenix program for South America, wherein the CIA provided a lot of the equipment, computer technology and police equipment, and worked to connect the intelligence service of different South American dictatorships, right-wing dictatorships that the CIA supported, Chile, Brazil, because the CIA coordinated a coup in Brazil in 1964. There was a moderate left-leaning leader named Raul Goulart, who was more like a Roosevelt Democrat, who was trying to introduce some progressive economic policies, to raise wages and a welfare state. But he was not a socialist. He wasn't pushing for the nationalization of industry, but he was more to the left, so they had to remove him, and they imposed a military dictatorship. And that was allied in 64. Pinochet came in 73, and Condor took root after Pinochet was in power, where the CIA helped connect with all this technology, policing technology. The governments connected together to surveil and develop blacklists, and the CIA assisted with the development of blacklists of subversives, who were people who challenged the dictatorship, left of center type people, sometimes politicians, and they were often kidnapped, and a lot were assassinated, like in the Phoenix program, where they were subjected to torture in the torture facilities, whether Brazil, Argentina also fell under a military dictatorship. So it was Argentina, Chile, Brazil, I think, were the key countries. There was also Paraguay under Alfredo Stroessner. And the U.S. pattern is to support the far right over any kind of leftist government. And there were many coups, like in Guyana, they overthrew Chedi Jagan. And this, I think there was an apology years later for this outrage. Chedi Jagan was also a left-leaning leader, and when Guyana got their independence from Britain, he was the head of state, and he was an Indian who was a very dynamic political leader with a progressive vision for his country. And the CIA stoked racial conflict between the Afro-Guyanese and Indian Guyanese population, deliberately stoked racial conflict, and overthrew Jagan, and they helped install Forbes Burnham as a dictator, and who was a very corrupt dictator. And eventually, there was, years later, they apologized. I think Jagan came back into power as an older man, like in the 90s at the end of the Cold War. But so those are just some. We can go in more. In Central America, there was a lot of horrific thing, like with the Guatemalan coup. In Haiti, there was the supporting the Duvalier dynasty, or brutal dictators in Haiti. Salvador, there was the murder of the Archbishop Romero, who was trying to unify the country and inspire the poor to be more engaged in politics. And he was murdered by these right-wing death squads. And the CIA had a strong hand in that dirty war that unfolded in El Salvador in the 80s. So there's case after case, and as you say, people in South America know that history, and they don't want to be continuous victims, so they are willing to fight back. If the U.S. invades Venezuela, it'll be an absolute bloodbath.
Oh, absolutely. When you have a country, and I think previous presidents, I'll put it like this, had better sense. They knew that putting troops on the ground in Venezuela with snipers on every corner in every village and every jungle, there'd be nowhere you could go that you wouldn't get cut to ribbons, that you wouldn't be attacked. So, even if you were able to overthrow the government, which wouldn't be easy, getting in Venezuela would be a death trap. It would make, Vietnam look like a day in the park. Now, once again, let's go back to once again we are reviewing the Covert Action magazine, which Dr. Kuzmarov is the editor and of course a writer over at Covert Action magazine. They got a lot of great articles. And the Gaza ceasefire agreement furthers ongoing the age of imperialism. You know, what's interesting is when you discuss the issue of Gaza, right? What happens is people say, you know, the mainstream media that at least allows that conversation makes it's Netanyahu. Netanyahu's a bad guy. If we could just get rid of Netanyahu and Smotrich, 2 or 3 bad guys, whatever, then we'd be fine. But when you look at, as an example, when you look at this particular protest, what are people saying? Settler colonialism. I think that the people who are opposing what's going on in Gaza overwhelmingly recognize that we're looking at imperialism, settler colonialism. We're looking at things that have been going on for centuries, that this is not new, particularly when you stick Tony Blair in the middle of it. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree, definitely. And unfortunately, the state of history education is very bad in the United States and West in general. So a lot of people here just don't have a good grasp of the historical pattern you're describing, and they don't understand. And I mean, I agree there is some complexity to this issue because the Jewish people were, faced a lot of oppression and anti-Semitism and pogrom and the Holocaust, and they had been kicked out of their land by the Romans years before. But unfortunately, the British and United States had their own designs over the region and kind of sought to use Israel for its own agenda. And the bottom line is that the native population was displaced. I mean, there were some elements in the Zionist movement that did seek cohabitation with the Palestinian and respect for them and their traditions. But unfortunately, the more violent, apocalyptic, fascist-leaning element of the Zionist movement, headed by Zev Jabotinsky, prevailed over the more humanist wing that was supported by people like Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt and Noam Chomsky. So you have the situation today, and you had the Nakba in '48. I mean, this is just the second Nakba. In the first Nakba, the Palestinians were pushed off their land violently. It was a clear case of ethnic cleansing. There's a good book by Ilan Pappé. And in fact, I think there was a member of the Israeli parliament who, out of defiance of Netanyahu, brought that book to the parliament, and Netanyahu was giving a terrible speech, and he just picked up the book and started reading the book and showed everybody what he was reading. And it's a good book, good by a very good historian about the historical what happened in the first Nakba in 1948, the violent displacement of the Palestinians. And unfortunately, we're seeing a continuity through the present day. And this is just a particularly violent episode that's gone on over the last couple of years. But, the Palestinians have been brutalized and mistreated for generations now. And it's a similar history to the history of, North America, where the Native American were pushed off their land and treated violently, called terrorists when they tried to reclaim their community or fight back in any way. At the time they did. I mean, if you look at Native American history, they did at times carry out raids on white settler community to try to kidnap girls or, did try and kill some of the settlers. But there was a rational motive. I mean, I don't support violence or terrorism, but if we want to stop it, we should understand what motivates it. And I mean, in both contexts, people's land got stolen. They were displaced, and they were often brutalized. I mean, the level of violence is always the settlers commit 10 to 50 times more violence. And so it's true in Native American history, and it's true in that history. The Israelis have a record of killing over many, many years. And unfortunately, a lot of the leaders who were venerated in Israeli society, like Ariel Sharon, had a background as being one of the most violent of the settler. Like Sharon was involved in the Kabia massacre in Jordan in the early 50s, and somehow he became a hero because he slaughtered 50 Palestinians in Jordan who were, allegedly organizing the Fedayeen to try and reclaim some of their land, their mount raids in Israel, and he went in and like destroyed the whole village, and he became a hero. So the settler culture develops as a kind of warped culture that venerates these violent heroes, the most violent elements of the settler society, and that's similar to Native American history. They venerated, great Indian killers were kind of heroes in the frontier, like Daniel Boone, this guy Jarbeau in California. They named a lot of streets after him, and only 100 years later, somebody, a historian, discovered that this guy was a sadistic killer who had killed so much, and yet so he petitioned to get rid of those street names, change the street name 100 years later. But obviously he was a hero if they named all these streets after him. He had been head of this militia in California, the Eel Rangers, that committed the worst atrocities against the Yuki Indian population. So there are some parallels, yeah. And there is, in academia, there is a growing community of scholars studying settler colonialism and looking at some of the parallels, like in British settler colonies like Kenya, and in North American history and Middle East history as well. So, and that's, I think, the history they're trying to suppress now, but it's a reality of our world. So,
Absolutely. I did want to ask you about this, and I don't know if you've heard, but I did want to touch base on it. Apparently, have you heard the Russians have sent a document to the U.S., and it has to do with the JFK assassination. It has to do with um, the Oswald going to the Soviet Union and things of that nature. Have you heard anything about that at all yet?
yeah, I think, yeah, that sounds familiar. It's not fresh on my mind, so I forget all the detail, but I recall reading what you're saying, and I think it just discloses new evidence that the Soviet Union, was reporting that he was a CIA agent. He was not one of them, because the official story had claimed that Oswald was a defector to the Soviet Union and a communist, and that he was involved with the Fair Play for Cuba committee. But a lot of scholarship had already shown that he was, like, with the Fair Play for Cuba, because that was a committee in the United States that demanded non-U.S. interference in Cuba, that the Cubans have a right to their own self-determination and their own revolution, and the U.S. shouldn't interfere. And it was a more left-leaning group that was more supportive of Castro. But it was uncovered a long time ago that Oswald was an infiltrator in that group. He was not really a genuine member. And in fact, he was the only member, because New Orleans, that was he was living in New Orleans before he went to Dallas, and that's where he was involved with the Fair Play for Cuba. But it was uncovered that he was working with this guy, Guy Bannister, who was an FBI agent and CIA agent who would penetrate left-wing organizations, and that Oswald was the only member. He founded the Fair Play for Cuba branch in New Orleans, and it was all for show. It was part of a black op to give him a legend, and they even staged a fight so he would get his name in the paper as being associated with the Fair Play for Cuba, so that could fit the story that he would this leftist kind of rogue KGB defector, and that the communists were behind the JFK assassination. And these documents are important because the KGB's assessment, I think, gave a clear-headed analysis that he was always a CIA agent. He never defected to the KGB. And Oswald was a CIA agent he was based for a period at the Itsugi CIA base in Japan. And I read that they had all kinds of MK Ultra experiments there. And some believe he may have been one of these people who are kind of programmed on command to do things for the CIA. And he was involved with other stuff there, the U-2 program. But yeah, when he went to Russia, I think it was as a CIA agent, and then his cover was that he defected. But that was just a made-up story. And I think these documents are important in adding further evidence of how the Soviets assessed the situation. So they are significant.
What's interesting is, and most Americans don't know this, when Oswald was nabbed or whatever, they were supposed to bring him before Congress, and he said something to the effect of, "Well, you better hurry because I'm not going to be around long." He said, "I'm just a patsy." He knew that he was a patsy, that he was, let's just say, the Tyler Robinson of his time. And it
Yes.
is your opinion that that, as I do, as most do, that he was in fact a patsy.
Yes, and in fact, covert action on the anniversary of the JFK assassination. We're doing a webinar this year, and we have 5 articles, and one is my article, which calls for the exoneration of Lee Harvey Oswald, that he was totally innocent. There's no evidence he was the shooter at all. In fact, there are 2 witnesses placed him on the 2nd floor of the Texas School Book Depository less than 2 minutes after the shooting, calmly drinking a Coke. And it was impossible, based on the structure of that building, that he could have shot Kennedy and ran down and be spotted calmly drinking a Coke in less than 2 minutes. And also, a secretary had spotted him in the same spot several minutes before the assassination. So, and nobody saw him going down the stairs. And there was a woman who was actually on the stairs, and she didn't see Oswald, where he would have to travel. So that evidence alone, shows he couldn't have been the shooter. And there's other evidence. There was no gunpowder found on him. And of course, the actual assassins, although there may have been some diversionary shots fired from the 6th floor, the actual assassins shot Kennedy from the front in the grassy knoll at closer range. And Oswald was also falsely accused of killing a police officer, Tippit, when that was impossible because he was witnesses placed him at his own boarding house. This is after the JFK assassination. Allegedly, he went home and then shot a Dallas police officer, Tippit. But in fact, the evidence shows he was at his boarding house and a bus stop at the time Tippit was shot. And there's new police report that came out that confirmed that the timing is crucial. The evidence that I've seen, and based on research I've done, and I'm drawing off some other scholars who really probed this in great detail, the conclusion I have is that Oswald, was a patsy. They were telling him where to go and what to do, but he never shot anybody, and he was totally innocent of the crime. And his reputation should be as such restored historically, that he's not a killer.
Yeah, and I don't know, we'll end by saying this. I'm looking at this Tyler Robinson, issue. And I've spent a lot of time preparing cases and in court and all that stuff, right? Criminal cases and civil, of course, but mostly criminal, 99% criminal cases. I don't see how possibly you could get a conviction, because what you have to do is the conviction has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. All you have to do is create reasonable doubt. And people, just with citizen journalists, are now presenting so much evidence that the doubt is beyond reasonable, and you don't have to create that in the mind of one of 12 jurors. And I'm looking at that and I'm like, there's no element where there isn't reasonable doubt. This Charlie Kirk thing really has, as they would like to say, 50 FBI former intelligence agencies would like to say, has all the earmarks of an intelligence operation.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Unfortunately, in these cases that are covered up and that are so heavily politicized, the question is, could he ever get a fair trial? And that's the pattern. There's plenty of reasonable doubt when it comes to James Earl Ray, when it comes to Sirhan, but they could never get a fair trial. Ray was coerced in the Martin Luther King killing. He was basically blackmailed and coerced and sold out by his own lawyers to accept a plea that he thought would save him from the death penalty. And when he realized he was being hoodwinked, he tried to get a new trial in vain for years. So we have to watch out for that. And unfortunately, again, these politicized cases, the historical pattern show that the whole court system is rigged. When they've hand selected a patsy and a certain narrative, that the authority want to advance, it's near impossible to get a fair trial. I hope he can get one.
Yeah, you and me both. I don't see how they can take it to court. I do not see how they can take this case to court. And of course, it would be a strong argument by his attorneys because the head of the FBI has been running around saying he's guilty. He's guilty. We got him. He did it. That alone can be used to make an argument that, look, the head of the FBI is telling the whole United States, we got him. He's the guy who did it. And that you've basically poisoned the entire jury pool. I don't see how he could get a fair trial. And if he did get one, his attorney gets, he has the privileges of discovery. That's going to be a problem. So we'll see what happens. They better watch him. They better make sure he doesn't go wandering around anywhere. Perhaps, he's suicidal or something like that. I fear that that's his fate. At any rate, Jeremy, thank you very much, everybody. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to go back to, and we're going to go all the way back to this. It's covertactionmagazine.com. You can go here. Look at this. Gaddafi's ghost haunts French ex-president Nicolas Sarkozy, all kinds of things. Denmark, Scandinavia on permanent war footing. Russians on the doorsteps, on and on and on. Lots of great stuff to do. Slain journalist was on threshold of exposing large-scale CIA mafia drug smuggling operation. So there's outstanding stuff. 9/11, go to the series drop down, 9/11, you name it. All the stuff is at covertactionmagazine.com. Go there, subscribe, keep up with their stuff. You have a YouTube channel?
I think they do. Yeah. And I have the Uncontrolled Opposition is a radio show and podcast that I do on Thursdays and has a Substack. So you can check that out as well.
Uncontrolled Opposition. I love that name. Thanks a lot, everybody. All right. Don't forget, there's lots of stuff scrolling across the bottom, including my PO box. If you want to contact me, email me. If you want to contribute, if you want to send something, snail mail, whatever. There's lots of ways to get in contact with me. Thank you for all my Patreon subscribers. Thank you for those who choose PayPal or Buy Me a Coffee or Cash App to contribute. The most important thing you can do is share this on all your social media platforms. I'm